The diner was a modest speck on the city's edge, its flickering neon sign casting a faint glow over the cracked pavement. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and warm bread, a cozy contrast to the biting night outside. Nathaniel Brooks, Nate to those who dared familiarity, stood frozen at the threshold, his polished shoes a stark mismatch to the worn linoleum floor. At 50, he was a billionaire, a name that reverberated through Wall Street and beyond, his empire a testament to decades of relentless ambition. Yet here, in this humble diner, his heart thundered like it hadn't in years. She was there, moving between tables with a tray balanced in her hands. Clara Thompson. Her hair, once a rich auburn, was now threaded with silver, pulled into a loose bun. Time had etched lines into her face, but her eyes, those steady, knowing eyes, were unchanged. Nate's breath caught as she approached, oblivious to the storm brewing in his chest. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice warm but tired, pulling a notepad from her apron. "What can I get for you?" He stared, the words he'd rehearsed for weeks dissolving. Then, in a whisper that trembled with memory, he spoke her name. "Miss Clara." She froze. The notepad slipped slightly in her grip, her smile faltering as confusion clouded her face. "I'm sorry, do I?" She stopped, peering at him. Then recognition struck, sharp and electric. Her eyes widened, a hand rising to her mouth as the notepad clattered to the table. "No," she breathed. Nate swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "It's me, the boy you saved." Hours earlier, Nate had sat alone in his penthouse office, the New York skyline sprawling before him like a glittering chessboard he'd long mastered. The city pulsed below, cars weaving through streets, billboards flashing promises, the hum of ambition a constant companion. He built this life from nothing, transforming a scrappy kid into a titan of industry. Tonight, though, the victory of a billion-dollar deal felt hollow. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, the amber liquid catching the faint glow of his desk lamp, and let his mind drift to a place he rarely visited, the past. Clara Thompson. The name jolted him, a buried ember flaring to life. She'd been his fifth-grade teacher, a beacon in a childhood shadowed by want. Nate didn't talk about those days, nights when hunger gnawed at his stomach, mornings when he trudged to school in shoes so worn his toes poked through. His mother had juggled dead-end jobs, her hands rough from labor, while his father had vanished before Nate could form a memory of him. School had been a lifeline, but when the fees piled up, he decided to let it go. At 10, he'd hunted for odd jobs, convinced education wasn't for kids like him. Then came Clara. She'd noticed him shrinking into the back of her classroom, too proud to beg, too desperate to hide. He'd scratched invisible notes in an empty notebook, pretending to keep up. One day, she'd kept him after class. "Nate," she'd said, her voice gentle but firm, "I spoke to the principal. Your fees are covered." He blinked, confused. "How?" She'd only smiled. "That's not important. What matters is you stay." He hadn't understood then, but years later, the truth hit. She'd paid for it herself. She bought him books, tutored him after hours, believed in him when the world saw only a lost cause. Without her, there'd be no skyscrapers, no private jets, no empire. Everything he was, he owed to her. Nate leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. How had he let decades slip by without finding her? Had she seen his face on magazine covers, heard his name on the news, and known she'd shaped him? He grabbed his phone, dialing his assistant with a voice steady but urgent. "Find someone for me. Clara Thompson. My old teacher. I need to know where she is." The search began with her old house, a tidy two-bedroom nestled in a quiet suburb. As a kid, he'd passed it on his walks home, envying the neat flower beds she tended. But when he knocked, a stranger answered. "Clara Thompson?" She moved years ago. No idea where. Disappointment twisted in his gut. He pictured her opening the door, her face lighting with recognition. Next, he tried the school. The rusted lockers and cracked playground stirred a flood of nostalgia, dreams of a bigger life born amid those faded walls. But the receptionist barely glanced up. "She doesn't work here anymore." "Retired?" Nate asked. An older teacher nearby shook his head. "Fired. Personal troubles, late too often." The principal didn't care. Cut her loose. Nate's fists clenched. Fired? The woman who'd sacrificed so much, discarded? Rage simmered beneath his calm exterior. "Where is she now?" Silence. Then a soft voice broke through. "Wait, I know you." An elderly woman, a former colleague of Clara's, squinted at him. "You're Nate Brooks. One of her kids." His pulse quickened. "Yeah, I need to find her." She smiled faintly. "She talked about you all the time. So proud. She's at a diner now, waitressing." The word hit like a blow. Waitressing. Clara, who'd molded futures, reduced to serving tables? He didn't wait for more. He stormed out, the address burning in his mind. This was no longer a search, it was a mission. The diner came into view as dusk settled, its faded charm a far cry from the glittering world Nate ruled. He'd imagined her retired, surrounded by books and peace, not toiling in a greasy kitchen. Guilt gnawed him. She'd given him a future, and life had repaid her with this. He stepped inside, the chime of the door's soft herald. The place was worn but warm, its booths scarred by time, a handful of patrons nursing coffee. And there she was, Clara, balancing plates with a quiet grace that belied her exhaustion. She'd aged, her frame frailer than he remembered, but her presence still carried that unshakable strength. She approached his table, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good evening, sir. What can I get for you?" He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Then her name slipped out. "Miss Clara." She stiffened, confusion flickering, then dawning realization. Her hands shook as she studied him, piecing together the boy beneath the man. "Nate?" she gasped, her voice breaking. He nodded, eyes misting. "It's me. The boy you saved." A sob caught in her throat. She reached out, trembling fingers brushing his sleeve as if testing reality. "Oh, Nate," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Look at you." He clasped her hands, steadying them in his. "I've been looking for you. For years." She laughed through her tears, shaky and soft. "I always wondered what happened to you. I hoped, I knew, you'd do something extraordinary. You made it happen," he said, voice thick. "You saw me when no one else did. Gave me a chance. I never thanked you." She shook her head, squeezing his hands. "You don't owe me anything." But he did. More than words could carry. He slid an envelope across the table. "This is for you. $1 million. Her eyes widened, shock stealing her breath. "Nate, no, I can't. Why not?" She wiped her tears, resolute. "I've always earned my way. You know that." He'd expected this, her stubborn pride, her selflessness. He leaned closer. "Then let me buy this diner for you. You own it. No more late shifts, no more struggling. You run it." Her lips parted, disbelief warring with hope. "Nate, that's... You gave your life to others," he cut in. "Let me give back." A long pause stretched between them, her eyes glistening. Then, slowly, she nodded. "All right," she whispered, a tear falling. A week later, the deed was hers. Clara's diner, renamed in her honor, became her domain. Nate watched from outside as she greeted customers, no longer a servant but a steward, her smile brighter than he'd ever seen. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, catching his gaze. "You already did," he replied, emotion roughening his voice. "A long time ago." She laughed, soft and warm. "I always knew you'd be special." He smiled, throat tight. "I had the best teacher." As he walked into the night, a rare peace settled over him. Success and power had built his empire, but this act of gratitude, had rebuilt his soul. True wealth wasn't in the millions he'd amassed. It was in the debt he'd repaid, not with money, but with a kindness that echoed hers.